was breathing but not alive. All my failures I tried to hide. It was my truth till I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. Now your mercy has saved my soul. Now your freedom is all that I know. The old me knew Jesus when I met you. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. I needed rescue, my sin was heavy, but chains break at the weight of your glory. I needed shelter, I was an orphan, but you called me a citizen of heaven. When I was broken, you were my healing. Your love is the air that I breathe in. I have a future, my eyes are open, 'cause when you called my name, I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day. You called my name and I ran out of that grave, out of the darkness into your glorious day.
Good morning and welcome to Highview Community Church online service for this Sunday, January the 16th. Obviously, you know that we have chosen to do an online service for this Sunday. It remains our desire at Highview to keep our doors open and to meet in person as much as possible throughout these days of the pandemic. But we are a small community, and we currently have a number of our teams who are either sick or isolating. So for this Sunday only, we have chosen to meet online with the hopes that we can be back together in person next Sunday, especially when it includes our family chat, which I'm going to talk about in a few seconds. Once again, thank you for your patience as we continually adapt and adjust plans. And if you like, you can join us after the service at 11:45 for a hot chocolate by the fire reunion. I'm looking forward to that and planning to be there myself. And you can see the link in the Friday update in order to get connected there. Long before the pandemic, struggles with mental health and mental issues have been part of the human story. Unfortunately, the church has not always been a safe place to talk about mental health for suffering people and their families. At Highview, we want to be a safe place where we can have real conversations about our real lives and offer it all to God. This week, we're beginning a 4-week series on mental health called Not Fine, Mental Health and God. And today's message is called Something's Broken. There are many different ways to lead and make decisions in a church. At Highview, we are an elder-led congregation, which means that we are led in our decisions by a team of godly men and women appointed for that task. And as we turn the page on a new calendar year, we wanted to remind you that our 2022 elders are Brandon Van Heusen, Megan Ogilvie, Eric Munnings, and Erin Wildsmith. The elders are here to serve and would like to remind you that you can contact them anytime with questions or concerns. And with that in mind, the elders invite you to mark your calendars for Sunday, January 23rd, that's next Sunday, for our first business meeting of the year. We call them family chats. And this is how you find out what's happening behind the scenes at Highview, to hear from our leaders and to ask questions. And also on the 23rd, we have set aside some time to listen to God together and share ideas on where He might be leading Highview in this next chapter, and you really won't want to miss it. The family chat will happen at 11 a.m. immediately following a shortened service, and this is going to be available online and in person. That's our hope. As we find ourselves facing yet another new wave of the pandemic, it can be very easy to feel alone and isolated. And one great way we found to stay connected to God and to one another throughout this time is through prayer. This is just a friendly reminder that you're welcome to submit your prayer requests and any praise items to our prayer squad at any time. You can do this by emailing Ann at info@hcckw.ca. And you're welcome to join in on the weekly prayer meeting. That's Wednesday mornings from 9:30 to 10:30 via Zoom. The link is provided in the emails that would be sent to you if you make a connection with Ann. And if you do not have any internet access or you do not want to pray out loud, there are still ways for you to participate. And again, Ann is the person to connect for those details. I'd like to read for us Luke chapter 5, verses 17 all the way to 21. One day, Jesus was teaching, and Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. They had come from every village of Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem. And the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal the sick. Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house to lay him before Jesus. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles into the middle of the crowd right in front of Jesus. When Jesus saw their faith, he said, "Friend, your sins are forgiven." The Pharisees and the teachers of the law began thinking to themselves, "Who is this fellow who speaks blasphemy? Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Jesus knew what they were thinking and asked, "Why are you thinking these things in your hearts? Which is easier to say, 'Your sins are forgiven,' or to say, 'Get up and walk'? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins." So he said to the paralyzed man, "I tell you, get up, take your mat and go home." Immediately, he stood up in front of them, took what he had been laying on, and went home, praising God. Everyone was amazed and gave praise to God. They were filled with awe and said, we have seen remarkable things today.
Who am I that the highest king would welcome me? I was lost, but he brought me in. Oh, his love for me. Oh, his love for me. Who the Son sets free. Whoa, he's free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Free at last, he has ransomed me, his grace runs deep. While I was a slave to sin, Jesus died for me, yes he died for me. Who the Son sets free, oh, he's free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. I am for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. Yes, I am who you say I am. Who the Son sets free, oh, he's free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. Who the Son sets free, who is free indeed. I'm a child of God, yes I am. In my Father's house, there's a place for me. I'm a child of God, yes I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am chosen, not forsaken. I am who you say I am. You are for me, not against me. I am who you say I am. I am who you say I am. Yes, I am who you say I am.
My journey with mental illness began in high school, or at least my awareness of my journey with mental illness began in high school. I think it had been something I'd been dealing with for a while prior to that. The short version of what happened was I had received a misdiagnosis. I was put on a medication, and that medication had a side effect of causing depression. That, combined with what was already going on, had some impacts on my life. I went to counseling, although I wasn't really the most engaged participant. But it eventually led me to drop out of my grade in high school. Moved back to Canada, and I restarted that grade in Canada from the mental section, essentially, of a local hospital. That was the first really, really dark time that I can remember in my life, where there didn't seem to be any hope that things would get better. Depression has been a constant part of my life. It's something that I am aware of or reminded of once or twice a day, every day. In the past, it's forced me to drop out of school a couple of times. I've lost jobs when I haven't been able to deal with it well. It's strained relationships. I think I might have even lost a few friends because of it. And honestly, I can't say that I blame them. A few years ago, I started having panic attacks, although I didn't know what they were at the time. And once I did figure it out, and I learned new strategies for those, it just felt like one other thing added. I was angry at God, and still occasionally am, for letting this happen. I've prayed regularly, especially earlier on, for him to take it away, and he hasn't. What he has done is given me the strength to continue. And I hope that one day this will no longer be part of my life. But I'll be really honest, I don't think that's going to be the case. I think that this is my life now, and I have to figure out how to live it. Every day, day by day.
If your digital life looks anything like mine, then every so often, whether you use Google Photos or whether you use social media, you might get like a little notification that pops up with a photo that will say, like, this time last year, or this time 3 years ago, and it will show you like a picture that you took on that day in the past. And I enjoy that feature. That's really fun to be able to step back into those moments and kind of see what it was like. Our real memories do not work like Google Photos. Our memories are like one part what happens to us, and another part the cultural stories that we tell ourselves about what happens to us. And that takes into account lots of things, including what we already think and believe about our experience. For example, call to your mind a day where it's 40 degrees outside, maybe some of the days that we had this past summer. And what do you think about when you think of one of those days? Well, if you are a Western person like me, then your first thought is probably 40 degrees is way, way too hot. I know there are some people who like 40 degrees, so good for you if that's you, but I think, oh, that's way too hot. And maybe you do too. And then maybe your second thought is like, well, okay, it might be hot outside, but I'm not expecting that to have a really big impact on my productivity for that day. Like, my to-do list is my to-do list, and I'm going to get it done one way or another, because that's the cultural story we tell ourselves in the West. Like, we get things done, and the weather doesn't really play a big part in that. Now, if you're from Thailand, you might think about 40 degrees in a different way. If you're from Thailand, 40 degrees is a temperature that happens quite regularly at certain times of the year, so I understand. And you might have a different cultural story around that kind of temperature. One that involves adapting to your environment, one that involves working with the weather rather than against it. If you play that cultural story, the Western one, that you might tell yourself about getting things done no matter what, and you try to actually do that, especially if you try to do it outside when it's really hot, what might happen is that you end up getting pretty sick. If you play out the Thai cultural story, you'll end up, I'm thinking, with a much healthier outcome. Our cultural stories affect what we think about what happens to us, and then how we respond. What cultural stories are at play for us around ideas of mental health and mental illness, both in culture sort of generally, and then more specifically in the church? You've probably noticed that there has been a shift in recent years about how mental illness is portrayed kind of in culture generally. So whether it's discussions in schools or in workplaces, whether it's stories that you might read on social media or in the news, or even celebrities and famous athletes opening up about their own stories and struggles, it seems like conversations around mental health are slowly beginning to come out of the shadows, sort of in culture generally. However, I'm not sure that's always the case in the church. The church has not always handled mental health struggles and mental illness with the kind of long suffering and love that are supposed to define the people of God. Mental illness, at least in some branches of the church at certain points, has often been sort of hushed up or pushed under the rug. So that's one response. Or then maybe on the other side of things, it's been even like vehemently condemned, or maybe even seen as like some kind of indication of like personal sin or not enough faith, or maybe even demonic possession. This has had the tragic consequence of leaving many suffering people, including pastors and their church leaders and their families, feeling as though they really had nowhere to turn. What's the cultural story here? Well, I think that the cultural story we sometimes tell in the church, kind of generally, can go a little bit like this. If I love God and obey God, if I've asked Jesus into my heart, then I will be safe and happy and okay. But I wonder if this is a lot more reflective of the edited version of events, the stories we tell ourselves about what happens to us, than a reflection of how reality actually works. Because life is more complicated than that, isn't it? You know, I think another thing that can happen sometimes if we're not careful in our faith communities is that sometimes we can fall into the trap of thinking that all this complexity around mental health struggles, but around other things too, you know, we can think of it as sort of like symptomatic of our postmodern world, as though at some earlier point in history, like the good old days, things were a lot simpler. But I think if we take a close look at our Bibles, we will see that Scripture actually paints a quite different picture. In the beginning, or very shortly after, things were not okay. Genesis 1. That's about as close to the beginning as we can get. And it paints us this really idyllic picture of God's creation and humanity's harmonious place in that creation. Genesis 1, verse 27. So God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. But just 2 chapters later in Genesis 3, things have already begun to go wrong. Genesis 3, verse 1. Now the serpent was more crafty than any of the wild animals the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, "Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden?" You probably know what happens next. Through subtle deception, the serpent convinces the man and woman to disobey God's only command, and catastrophe results. In the beginning, in Genesis 1, God had placed human beings in a beautiful network of interconnected, nurturing relationships with God, with self, with each other, and even with the earth. Yet the introduction of sin into that ecosystem wreaked havoc, the ultimate invasive species, and things no longer worked as they should. Something's broken. And that something affects all the relationships God had intended to be safe and life-giving. Relationships with God, with others, with creation, and even with our own selves. Though, it's tempting to tell ourselves a story that says at some earlier point in human history, maybe when our parents or grandparents were growing up, things were easier. That doesn't seem to be the story we find in Genesis. In fact, Scripture bears witness to something that much more closely resembles our own complicated experience in the beginning, or very shortly after. Things were not okay. Since the rebellion of human beings against God way back in the garden, nothing about our relationships with God, self, and others has been working properly. The Apostle Paul puts it this way, creation groans. That's how he articulates that struggle. In the beginning, or very shortly after, things were not okay, and we live in the aftermath of all that not okayness played out in troubles and hardships of every variety, including illnesses of all sorts, including mental health challenges. All these things kind of fall under that umbrella. For the next month, we are going to have a conversation about mental health together at Highview in a teaching series called Not Fine, Mental Health and God. In this 4-week series, which is by no means exhaustive at all, but we will explore some of the complexity of living with common realities which all fall under that sort of umbrella term, mental health, including anxiety, grief, and one picture of what it might look like to live faithfully with a mental illness. This series is not intended to be about easy answers or easy fixes or easy theology in response to complex situations. And actually we have small videos throughout this series of high viewers telling their own stories, and they will, I think, confirm that it's not simple or easy. I am not a psychotherapist or a counselor or a mental health worker of any variety, and I am not qualified to make diagnoses or provide any sort of therapy. But I am a human and a Christian. I do life in community. alongside close friends and family members as they continue to navigate precarious mental health and sometimes complicated mental illnesses. I know, even in my own journey, the precarious nature of good mental health, especially in the face of this ongoing pandemic. And I know these things because I live it just like you do. And while there may have been a time in the church's life where mental health struggles or mental illness were ignored or dismissed as issues of not having enough faith, I think one author I read put it like this, like the church can do better than that, and I agree with her. I think the church can do better, and that God is near to us, even in complexity and darkness, including all manner of mental health concerns. Now, before we go much further in our teaching series on mental health, let's break out some definitions. Sometimes mental health and mental illness are terms that are used kind of interchangeably, and we're not quite sure where one ends and the other begins. And as I was doing my own research, I realized I wasn't even really clear on where the line was. So here's some definitions that I found from the Canadian Mental Health Association. They define mental health this way. Mental health is a state of well-being, including thoughts, emotions, feelings of connectedness to others, and ability to navigate life's highs and lows in a way that's similar to physical health. And here's actually the really interesting part for me. Someone can experience poor mental health without a mental illness. And a person with a mental illness can have excellent mental health. So, keeping this in mind, this morning we're going to think about that a little bit together, and we are going to challenge that cultural story that gets told sometimes if we're not careful in our faith communities. Like, if I play my cards right, if I love and obey God, then I will be safe and happy and okay. Or to put it a different way, health and happiness are normal, and illness and struggle are both in the minority and also some kind of indication that something is wrong with the person who's suffering. But I think, at least in terms of the normalcy part, I think we know that all variety of struggles are the norm for us as human beings. Mental health struggles and mental illness are extremely common. And here are some more stats from the Canadian Mental Health Association. In any given year, 1 in 5 people in Canada will personally experience a mental health problem or illness. By age 40, 50%, that's like half the population, will either have or have had a mental illness. Mental illness affects people of all ages, education, income levels, and cultures as well. Major depression affects approximately 5.4% of the Canadian population, and anxiety disorders affect approximately 4.6%. About 1% of Canadians will experience bipolar disorder. Eating disorders affect approximately 1 million Canadians and are 10 times more likely in women than in men. Substance use disorders affect approximately 6% of Canadians. And in 2019, so that's before the pandemic began, 4,012 Canadians died by suicide. In her book, Troubled Minds, Amy Simpson points out that if the church can offer a compassionate response to people who are suffering in all kinds of ways, suffering from illnesses like heart disease, diabetes, cancer, or AIDS, if we can listen and offer support without judgment to people facing complex struggles like unemployment, homelessness, relationship struggles, poverty, and addiction, why can't we do the same for mental health? If all of the above represent the normal consequences of living on a fallen planet and not individual sin or disfavor with God, then what's to stop the Christian community from exhibiting the sort of creative compassion that describes the people of God when we are at our best? Those are hard questions. And, I think maybe one of the reasons that we struggle to do this in this area when we can do it in a lot of other spaces, I think maybe part of it has to do with that familiar feeling that we are in over our heads. Like we don't know what to do or how to help, or if anything will help at all. In the face of the unfixable, we often default to black and white thinking and black and white theology because it's easier. In the face of severe suffering, we often look for someone to blame, even if that person, the one we blame, ends up being the one who is suffering. And, sometimes we might ask, why do we do that? Why would we do that? Why do we always look for someone to blame? And I think maybe it's a defense mechanism, to sort of defend ourselves from the despair that comes from knowing that someone is suffering so much and we can't change that for them. This sort of sense of looming despair is something that I know both personally and professionally. As a pastor, I want to help people. I think most of us who ended up in this profession sort of got here because, at least partly for that motivation, we feel like we want to help people who are suffering. But often when people come to me with all manner of struggles, there's so little I can do for them. And if you've come to me for help, then you've probably experienced this yourself. There's so little I can do except listen and pray. And even though I believe in prayer, I believe in listening, sometimes that doesn't feel like very much. Again, I'm not in any way a mental health professional or a counselor. But, in the same way that I'm not qualified to fix people from the congregation who might come to me for help, I'm also frustratingly not qualified to fix or rescue my friends and family when they have struggles, and that can be even worse. But what if we don't have to fix people in order to help? There's one story from the Gospels that gives me some hope that maybe there is something we can do in the face of the unfixable. Ruth Ann read this for us already this morning, but let me just recap this passage from the Gospel of Luke, beginning chapter 5, beginning in verse 17. One day Jesus was teaching, and Pharisees and teachers of the law were sitting there. They had come from every village in Galilee and from Judea and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was with Jesus to heal the sick. Some men came carrying a paralyzed man on a mat and tried to take him into the house to lay him before Jesus. When they could not find a way to do this because of the crowd, they went up on the roof and lowered him on his mat through the tiles in the middle of the crowd, right in front of Jesus. Being paralyzed is the ultimate unfixable problem. And if you have any experience trying to help a fully grown adult who can't move their body, or if you are that fully grown adult and you can't move your body like you want to, then you know it's difficult, frustrating, and exhausting, both physically and emotionally. And maybe the worst part is, from a friend perspective or a family perspective, is the sense of powerlessness that you have to really get to the heart of the problem. Whatever these guys had tried to do, they would not be able to make their paralyzed friend walk. But what's interesting about this story is that they don't try to do that. At least not in what we have recorded. Instead, they decide to take him to Jesus, and then they do what's necessary to make sure he gets there. If you grew up in church like I did, then maybe you've heard this story in lots of sermons. I certainly have. And every time I've ever heard this story preached, the heroism of the friends is always highlighted. Like, look at these guys, they cut a hole in the roof, like, so much determination, and I don't want to diminish that. Like, absolutely, yes. But when I think about it now as an adult with some of the experiences that I've had since, you know, this kind of heroism, this kind of advocacy is really not all that different from what loved ones of a sick person do every day. Pouring themselves out in advocacy, going to all sorts of crazy, exhausting lengths to ensure that their loved one has access to the care or opportunities others take for granted. And you know this if you care for an elderly parent or you have a disabled person in your family. If that's part of your story, as it is for me, then you probably haven't, well, I don't know, maybe you've cut a hole in the roof, maybe you haven't, but I bet you've come pretty close in terms of the lengths that you've had to go to ensure care. My family certainly has come close, and maybe you have too. But here's what I want us to notice about all of this, the everyday heroism of these guys and their paralyzed friend. Their friendship makes a difference. Friendship. It's one of the best, and I think maybe underrated gifts that God gives to human beings. There are lots of problems friendship can't fix. Being paralyzed is one of them. Mental illness is another. But fixing is never really the point. Suffering of any kind is already hard enough, as everybody knows who's ever been a human. But I think we also know, any of us who've ever been a human, that suffering is made just so much worse when we feel like we're doing it alone. Friendship is the antidote to feeling like your suffering is something you do alone. It embodies the powerful love of God by insisting that you are not alone. And that matters. What I want us to notice about this story is how these ordinary heroes refused to leave their ill friend behind. They helped him get to Jesus when he could not get there himself, and that made a difference. The aftermath of the introduction of sin into creation changed everything and infected all of our relationships, all the relationships God intended to be life-giving and whole with God, with others, with the earth, and even with ourselves. And I certainly do not want to suggest that mental illness is the result of individual sin or lack of faith. We don't have access to that kind of information. Just ask Job's friends. They found out the hard way that we don't get to know that kind of thing. But what I would like to suggest is that suffering and illness and brokenness of all kinds, including mental illness, are all part of the complex aftermath of the presence of sin and death in a creation God made good and intended for life. We, all of us, experience the consequences of living on a broken planet. And many of us experience this brokenness through the unique suffering of mental illness or mental health struggles. Suffering, including mental illness, is a normal part of living in a fallen world. And while you and I cannot fix our suffering friends, that does not mean there's nothing we can do. We can harness the power of friendship. Friendship will not make a clinically depressed person snap out of it. It won't quiet the frantic thoughts of a panic attack. Friendship cannot give a person suffering from schizophrenia a firm grasp on reality, but it can do one thing. It can demonstrate and communicate the most profound spiritual truth that says, you are not alone. Again, not a counselor, not a mental health worker of any sort, but I know from my own life that friendship matters. Earlier in the service, you heard Dave, my husband, talk a little bit about his battle with depression, and he will have the chance to tell you his story in full later in this series. But I want to tell you a little bit about our family story around Dave's depression from my perspective, and I have Dave's full blessing to do this. So a few years ago, Dave was going through a particularly dark time in terms of his depression. As is often the case with these sorts of things, the specific reasons why that happened are hard to isolate. We had recently gone through a miscarriage. Work was stressful, his and mine. It was winter and dark, and that can be a hard time for a lot of people. We weren't sleeping that well. Whatever the reason, at the end of January 2020, things got really bad. And from my perspective, what it looked like was Dave basically went to bed for an entire week and was just not, barely able to respond to me or the boys, at all. This was not the first time I'd seen Dave go through a deep, dark depression. By that point, we'd been married for over 10 years, and so we'd been around the block before, but I'd not always responded in the best way. In the past, I would try to get Dave to talk about what was happening, or I would try to fix, things myself, but that never worked, and really just added extra pressure onto our marriage. This time, for lack of any better ideas, or maybe by God's grace, or maybe some combination, I tried a different approach. Friendship and presence. Instead of trying to fix or rescue, I let Dave respond to me as he felt able to do so. I invited him to participate in our family, but I didn't demand it. I parented the boys. I picked up the slack. In retrospect, maybe I could have asked my own friends for a little bit of help in this situation, but that is a different sermon for another time. None of these things fixed anything, but they did communicate to Dave that he was not alone. And that really mattered. Now, in our story, eventually Dave was able to return to himself and to be the engaged parent and partner that he just normally is. That's Dave's personality, to be fully engaged in our family. And at that point, he was able to take some proactive steps at managing his mental illness. Again, you will hear his story in his own words later in the series, but I think he will tell you that in this instance, not that I'd always responded well in the past, but in this instance, my non-judgmental friendship during that dark time was a bit of a turning point in our relationship. Mental illness is a normal part of living on a broken planet. And while friendship does not fix anything, it does matter. We're going to end our time together this morning by listening or singing, if you want to the old hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. In times of suffering, mental health suffering or otherwise, we have the opportunity to be Jesus with skin on for one another, and so embody the creative compassion that defines the people of God when we're at our best. So a few years ago, Dave was going through a particularly dark time in terms of his depression. As is often the case with these sorts of things, the specific reasons why that happened are hard to isolate. We had recently gone through a miscarriage. Work was stressful, his and mine. It was winter and dark, and that can be a hard time for a lot of people. We weren't sleeping that well. Whatever the reason, at the end of January 2020, things got really bad. And from my perspective, what it looked like was Dave basically went to bed for an entire week and was just not, barely able to respond to me or the boys, at all. This was not the first time I'd seen Dave go through a deep, dark depression. By that point, we'd been married for over 10 years, and so we'd been around the block before, but I'd not always responded in the best way. In the past, I would try to get Dave to talk about what was happening, or I would try to fix, things myself, but that never worked, and really just added extra pressure onto our marriage. This time, for lack of any better ideas, or maybe by God's grace, or maybe some combination, I tried a different approach. Friendship and presence. Instead of trying to fix or rescue, I let Dave respond to me as he felt able to do so. I invited him to participate in our family, but I didn't demand it. I parented the boys. I picked up the slack. In retrospect, maybe I could have asked my own friends for a little bit of help in this situation, but that is a different sermon for another time. None of these things fixed anything, but they did communicate to Dave that he was not alone. And that really mattered. Now, in our story, eventually Dave was able to return to himself and to be the engaged parent and partner that he just normally is. That's Dave's personality, to be fully engaged in our family. And at that point, he was able to take some proactive steps at managing his mental illness. Again, you will hear his story in his own words later in the series, but I think he will tell you that in this instance, not that I'd always responded well in the past, but in this instance, my non-judgmental friendship during that dark time was a bit of a turning point in our relationship. Mental illness is a normal part of living on a broken planet. And while friendship does not fix anything, it does matter. We're going to end our time together this morning by listening or singing, if you want to the old hymn, Turn Your Eyes Upon Jesus. In times of suffering, mental health suffering or otherwise, we have the opportunity to be Jesus with skin on for one another, and so embody the creative compassion that defines the people of God when we're at our best.